So a little bit I want to talk about now is actually scopes and also commands. So a command is, for example, create canvas with some parameters here, and it ends with a semicolon. So this is one command, and so to speak. So this semicolon means, okay, command is over. So this is the ending of it. But then, something confusing happens, because you can see here there's a semicolon here, there's a semicolon here, there's a semicolon here. So quite a lot of things has a semicolon, but then, whoa, what happens here? The if statement doesn't have a semicolon, the function draw doesn't have a semicolon, the setup doesn't have a semicolon in the end. And the reason for that is because right after this command there is a start of a scope and an end of a scope. So here we have draw, we have start of a scope, we have end of a scope down here. So these scopes, when you have a scope like this, when you have a curly bracket that defines a scope, then you don't use semicolon here. And scopes are the magical things of programming, and you need to kind of understand it, because scopes are groups of commands that relates to something. So in this case, this scope here defines the group of commands that relates to the function draw. And this scope here relates to groups all the commands that relates to setup. In the same sense here, this if statement here, if it's true, it will run the group of commands inside these two, this scope, and else it will run the group of commands inside this scope here. So that's how the logic is to it. And what you have to be aware of is that this is the structure you build. So you build these scopes up in the system, and then that is actually how you program. So I can actually make a scope inside a scope. I can make another if statement here, and then make a scope in here and do something with that. So if this condition is met, then it will go in here, and then I will make another condition here where something might happen. So already now you're actually doing nested scopes, because the first scope you have is actually the draw scope, and inside the draw scope you have an if scope here, and you also have an else scope here. So you already have the scopes running. And be aware, no semicolon here. This is the most common beginner mistake, and it's torture, because as soon as you put that semicolon there, your program might actually in some cases run, but it will behave really strange, because the scope is not connected to the if statement anymore. So please, for the love of not my sanity but yours, try to not put a semicolon right here when there's a scope coming right after. So no semicolon here and no semicolon here. These two places does not have a semicolon, and it's super important not to do it. I hope you learned this. Try to remind yourself a million times not to do it. It's a tricky thing to remember.